session. So let me, before I introduce the speaker, let me once again explain to you the context why we wanted to have this module in our workshop this time. In the morning, as I said, two major goals of this project is to relate it to one about Hawassa University, your college, and the other one is a policy recommendation to the government. And then in that regard, even in the morning session, Innocent briefly introduced about some of the project that is likely to start to be implemented from next year, and then supported by the COICA. And then in that regard, we thought that it may be good for us to have a chance to understand what are the policy implications and then theoretical basis or other related issues, right? And then, of course, this presentation is not about the project per se, but I'm sure that it will be very helpful for us to at least understand sort of the current status in terms of the policy development in the forestry and then land use sector. And then, so that's what we plan to do. And in that regard, that the speaker today is Luis Miguel. He is from now Seoul. And then Luis has been visiting and has been working on the Ethiopia pretty to a large extent these days. And then we thought that the Luis is one of the good speakers. And then this publication work will be done not only solely by Luis, the lead author, but there are other authors as well, including the Christopher Dickinson. I think Chris, also from Seoul, he joined our session today. So Chris used to be actually in Addis Ababa until very early this year. Chris is also an expert on this issue as well. So before I hand over microphone to Luis, Chris, would you want to briefly say hello to everybody?
Okay, Sabeno. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's fine in Addis. And yeah, I left Ethiopia in February. And I missed the very good coffee from Ethiopia. And hello to any of my old colleagues who are here, who are on. I see Mr. Zianu is there, and Innocent. So hello, hope everyone's fine. Mr. Shin, good afternoon. It's now evening here, so please go ahead with the discussion. It's good to see everyone.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. And then now I'd like to introduce the Luis to all of you. And then Luis, you need to turn on your microphone and the video now.
Yes.
Okay, so where are you? It looks like you have a wonderful background there. What is it?
The background is some of the mountain areas in Oromia.
Oromia, wow, right, sounds familiar, right? So, yes. By putting the picture as his background, I think he is already very well qualified to be a speaker today for us, right? Even if we can give you a round of applause, but once again, thank you very much for joining our workshop today and then share what you have been working on. Okay, so you have about 40 minutes. We are very flexible. We have been very flexible, right? And then so then after that, maybe you might want to have some brief Q&A session. Okay, so I'd like to hand over the microphone to Luis now. So Luis, floor is yours, and everybody, you need to turn on the video. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues in Ethiopia, and good evening from Seoul, Korea. My name is Luis Miguel Aparicio. I work with GGI. I'm a senior officer for forest and business development here in our headquarters in Korea. And it is my pleasure having a conversation with you. I know many of you are or most of you are probably foresters and people working in the forest sector. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, and this is going to be a bit of a refresher. What we are going to discuss today are some of the challenges and opportunities related to forest landscape restoration, with emphasis in Ethiopia, but most of these concepts, or all of these concepts, are actually applicable to many forest landscapes across the world. And what I'm bringing to you today is a bit of a summary of experiences from different parts of the world. So with that introduction, I would like to share my screen and start with the presentation. Can you see my screen now? Yes? Okay, perfect. So the initial part of the presentation will be more of a refresher, as I said, of the general concepts, the background of forest landscape restoration. And we will start talking about land degradation in the beginning of the presentation. So, well, land degradation is a problem that is present all over the world. 35% of the ice-free surface of the globe is facing some level of land degradation. And this has consequences in especially erosion and loss of soil organic carbon and nutrients and biodiversity, and with that, a loss of productivity in the lands. And we need to mention that the soil is probably one of the most, or the most important resource that we have in land ecosystems. So basically, just to mention here, you can see in the screen, but the erosion that is happening across the world is calculated to take between 25 to 40 billion tons per year of the topsoil. And this is reducing the crop yields and the ability to store carbon and cycle carbon and nutrients and water. So forest degradation refers to a loss of the productivity and the capacity of the forest and the the forest landscape to provide ecosystems goods and services. And this has effects and consequences that are across different areas. So there are consequences in the biological composition of the ecosystem. There are water-related consequences, land-related, social, and economic consequences that need to be taken into consideration. Moreover, we are about to start the decade of action for the SDGs, and land degradation has consequences in terms of hampering our efforts to improve the local people capacity of adapting to climate change and the countries to comply with their NDCs and attain the goals, the SDGs, especially SDG number 15, which refers specifically to life on land and the goal of protecting, restoring, and promoting the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. But this is not the only one. Also, there are connotations with ending poverty, food security, water availability, combating climate change, and more. For example, peace and justice, SDG number 16, which is something that we are working on currently in GGGI and supporting the Korean Forest Service in shaping a program with global scope for supporting peace building, environmental peace building related to forest activities. So land degradation, if it continues in the current trend, this is going to hamper all these efforts. And well, now I wanted to share some basic concepts related to landscape restoration. So Landscape restoration, ecological restoration, is an intentional process to start or accelerate the recovery of an ecosystem from a degraded state. And when we are referring to landscapes, we are talking about a mosaic of ecosystems. We are not talking exclusively about forests or intact forests or degraded forests, but we are talking about the integrity of the landscape as a functioning system. And it is a system of different land uses. And it's a system where people inhabit and have different interests. So when we are talking about landscape restoration, we are not talking about individual sites. We are talking about restoring the functionality of this whole system. And well, a very good example of these functioning systems are the watersheds, which in Ethiopia are used as the planning unit for sustainable land management and the level of interventions. So this has to probably resonate in all our minds, because we are, as forestry professionals, used to these concepts. And well, the landscapes approach, what it talks about is about the interaction of different land uses and different stakeholders that have different interests. And that is why the participatory decision-making is so important, because what we need to seek is a balance between these different interests. Sometimes these interests are conflicting. Why? Well, because probably the conservationist would like to preserve or restore back to the initial pristine stage of the land for most of the land. And at the same time, there could be different interests from pastoralists, agriculturalists, mining, infrastructure, settlements. So with a landscapes approach, what we need to find is a balance, a trade-off between all these interests. And so that's why the decision-making needs to incorporate all the expectations of different users, different stakeholders across the landscape. And here are some additional considerations. Well, we are expecting certain benefits, and these benefits are going to have different characteristics. We are expecting economic, social, and environmental benefits. So economy diversification, job creation, poverty alleviation, food security, and at the same time, soil retention, climate change mitigation, climate regulation, water regime regulation, all these environmental services that are so valuable and sometimes underrepresented in decision making. All these benefits need to be pondered when we are planning for landscape restoration. And speaking of the benefits, I wanted to bring to you some information about this mitigation potential, climate change mitigation potential, and how this climate change mitigation potential could mean funding opportunities. And I'm sure in the next session, Professor Chung will tell us more about opportunities that arise from climate change mitigation in the current Paris Agreement context. So I will not talk about that, but I wanted to bring to your attention this article. It's an article published last year, and it probably has one of the most comprehensive analysis of the impacts in terms of climate change mitigation of landscape restoration activities across the different options that exist. So I won't explain this to you, but I'm happy to share the article with you, with whoever is interested. But just to show that there are tremendous potential for climate change mitigation based on the carbon sequestration of the forest ecosystems. And the agroforestry ecosystems and the different ways of restoring forested landscapes, including wetlands and mangroves. So on the other hand, we have the normal perception about forest landscape restoration. So we know all these benefits. All these benefits are quantified in the billions of dollars per year that are lost. So there is a cost to humanity if we continue with the trend of landscape degradation. But at the same time, the common perception of forest landscape restoration is that it is a high risk business. Why? Well, because it takes a long time to attain the results. So commitment, long-term commitment by governments and by stakeholders is required. But at the same time, there's a high uncertainty because, as we mentioned before, we are operating in areas where populations live and they have different interests. So because of that, the nature of these projects entail a certain level of risk. And it also has a high cost, or at least that is the perception. So the cost, the dollars per hectare invested in the different options can be measured in the thousands or tens of thousands per hectare. And this of course depends on the type of intervention that we are planning. And we are going to talk about this a bit more later, but different interventions have different costs. So for the policymakers and for the forest practitioners, it is important that we rescue these differences and that we highlight the benefits and the benefits from different interventions at different costs. But in general, the studies performed by FAO, for example, show that there's always a positive balance. There is always a net benefit from forest landscape restoration, besides or despite the perception of this high risk. So just to show a bit of the Ethiopian context, on the top left corner, we see an Afro-montane forest in its probably not pristine, but close to pristine state. And on the right, we see an intervened area. And the distance between those two photos is very, very small. So it's basically, the picture on the right is taken less than 10 minutes from the picture on the top left. And the picture on the bottom left is some of the pressures that are occurring in that forest. So there are needs of the local population that need to be satisfied. So when planning landscape restoration, we need to keep in mind what the pressures are, what the needs are, what the drivers of deforestation and degradation are, and plan for activities, interventions that will ease some of the pressure on the existing forest by producing the same benefits, the same goods and services that population are experiencing, that are needing, and that are driving them to cause degradation and deforestation. And in the right, you see people doing cultivation, and you can see the erosion happening. It's very clear, it's very obvious. There's laminar erosion occurring in the picture. And well, we know the nature of Ethiopia, but in many other countries with the same kind of topography and with high population pressure, well, there's cultivation needs. People need to sustain their families and produce their food. But at the same time, there are some conflicts between the current use and the capacity and the sustainability of the processes. This is another picture taken in the same area where, well, you see the eucalyptus plantation and the community involved in maintaining the plantation, basically to satisfy the same needs that move them to drive deforestation and degradation in the adjacent forest. So now when planning for forest landscape restoration, we need to find a balance between 4 important questions. Why we want to restore, where the land is available and the conditions are supportive of this kind of activities, when we need the land to be restored, and what is the time frame, what is the urgency of restoring the landscape, and how are we going to do this? And this is linked to the budget availability. And the last 2, urgency and budget, are very closely linked. So describing a little bit of the process, and this is a simplification of the process for landscape restoration. We could say that there are 3 phases: a readiness phase, an implementation phase, and a sustainability phase. And when we're saying sustainability phase, what we mean is that landscape restoration, forest landscape restoration, goes beyond the mere fact of planting trees. We need to make sure that those trees survive. We need to make sure that the objectives of our landscape restoration, the why in the previous slide, is accomplished. So in the readiness phase, we need to do a diagnostic of the drivers of deforestation and degradation, and what is the vulnerability of these systems. And systems, again, not only for forests, not only standing forests, but for the whole productive system, which is in the jurisdiction that we are intervening, be it a woreda, a kebele, a watershed, a specific location. We need to analyze what are the drivers, because otherwise we risk that the investment, which is high in terms of money and effort and time and people involvement, it can be lost. So for that, we need to define objectives and define a plan on how we're going to implement this based on the existing priorities. The second phase of implementation necessarily needs to start with participatory zoning and having the local people decide where it is more appropriate to undertake the landscape restoration, or the different activities of the landscape restoration that we will see further in the presentation. And for the sustainability phase, important elements are the monitoring of the process and maintaining a sustainable flow of resources that will enable the system to continue operating beyond the initial establishment phase. Many times, and this happens all over the world, tremendous efforts, tremendous amounts of money are put into planting trees. But if we don't guarantee that these trees that are being planted and these systems that are being implemented continue over time, then we cannot guarantee that the benefits that we spoke about before will be attained. In this initial diagnostic phase, identifying what are the drivers of degradation and deforestation, and what is the vulnerability of the lands, and the systems to the different pressures that occur. But right now we know climate change will affect tremendously most of Africa and great part of Asia, all over the world, but different countries, especially in Africa and Asia, are very sensitive to the effects of climate change. And when we talk about this, we refer to projecting the future scenarios. So we know that some parts of the world and some parts of Africa and some parts of Ethiopia will face different pressures. Some areas will receive more precipitation over maybe longer or maybe shorter periods of time. Some other areas will receive less precipitation than they did before. So when planning, it is important that we consider what is likely to be the future, the climate conditions that our landscape restoration will have to develop across. Also important, identifying who are the stakeholders and what are their interests. So what will be the pressures probably in the future, the plausible trends on needs to expand growth, production, needs to expand cultivated lands, and then take stock of the previous experiences and learn from the previous experiences, not to make the same mistakes. So when defining the objectives, we need to make sure that our objectives are realistic, are feasible, and that we can measure the effects of our intervention. So linked to the previous question, who is going to restore the landscape, and what are their interests, and what policies are there in place in my country, in my jurisdiction? What institutions will underpin these efforts, and who will benefit? Is this for the benefit of very few, or is this for the benefit of the majority of people that inhabit this area? So we need to select some benchmarks to measure our implementation and define how we're going to engage the stakeholders. The different stakeholders have different interests, and we need to find an alignment with the priorities, the country priorities that we will see a bit later too, and then try to find the feasibility and the feasible areas based on the participation of the local stakeholders. And for this, an initial phase will be raising the awareness of what are the benefits and what are the potential negative impacts. So participation of the community in planning the intervention is important. This is a picture taken in a participatory session in Myanmar, taken a couple of years ago in one of the projects that we are undertaking in GGGI. It's like participatory maps, where the areas, what kind of interventions in which areas. And then the process of actual implementation should be done through involvement of stakeholders, and keeping in mind that resources are always scarce. So we need to focus on efficiency. We need to focus on obtaining the best benefits at the least cost. And for that, capacity building will be important. And trying to find a combination of benefits that will satisfy the needs of the local population. And try to quantify these needs, that these benefits means all the different environmental goods and services that can be obtained from our intervention. Is it going to be just wood? May not be just as sustainable as if we do an integrated approach with timber and non-timber forest products that includes a variety of products and involves a variety of people, stakeholders. And in planning these interventions, well, there needs to be a combination of biological and physical interventions. And Ethiopia is a leader in having experienced different types of interventions. And some of these interventions can be agroecological, and can be protective measures, and can be actual forest restoration, forest plantation, or assisted natural regeneration. And in this point, we need to highlight the experience of Ethiopia with exclosures, for example, in the case of Tigray, with several thousands of hectares that are being restored through this method. And this method is well understood as very cost effective. This is another picture this is Indonesia. This is an agroforestry system in Indonesia where fruit trees and and coconuts and different crops are coexisting in the same landscape. This is another picture from Myanmar with rice cultivation associated with windbreakers and sugar palm that exist as a system. This is the same picture from Ethiopia, from Oromia. But this is Oromia when it's all green. And in the same time, this picture showing the physical interventions, this gabion to reduce the effect of erosion. And what we see here is the need of the coexistence of the biological measure and the physical measures. It's the same landscape that I had in the back as my background. So, dry conditions and loss of vegetation cover. What happens when the first rains come? So the erosive capacity of precipitation in the absence of vegetation cover is enormous. The impact of the falling of the raindrops and how this carries the topsoil is enormous. So activities and measures need to be put in place to reduce erosion. The different estimates different estimates exist for the amount of soil loss in Ethiopia, depending on when they were measured and what methods they used. But in general, what we see is tons of soil being lost per hectare every year with every rainy season. And this is another picture just to show an example of some of the cultural measures that need to be put in place. So basically, without the implementation or the enforcement of the free grazing ban, most of the efforts put in tree planting, in exclosure, in assisted natural regeneration will probably not be as successful as if the communities do implement the free grazing ban. So for this, stakeholder participation, stakeholder organization is paramount. So the last part of the process, this is the beginning of the sustainability section of the process, has to do with monitoring. And for monitoring, we need to highlight the importance of intersectoral coordination. Not all the ministries are present with the same presence, the same level of staffing and budget across the country. And this applies in Ethiopia or in my country, I'm from Peru, or across the world. So intersectoral coordination is basic to capitalize on the limited resources and to ensure that the lessons are learned and that we can adapt our management systems based on accurate monitoring and timely monitoring of what's actually happening with our restoration processes. And this is what I was mentioning before, adaptive management. So based on the results of monitoring, we need to adjust our strategies if it's needed and generate knowledge. And if there are new technologies, we can also adjust our methods based on the results of monitoring and the emergence of new science and new evidence. So this is just a tiny extract of the national policy framework that exists in Ethiopia. There are a number of policy instruments and in place in Ethiopia, but I wanted to highlight the objectives of the CRGE strategy that put tremendous importance on the protection and the restoration of forests to achieve the low carbon development that is the target for the next years. But linked to this, well, there is the NDC, there is the National Adaptation Plan. This is linked to the GTP. There is a number of policies, and they are all converging to the same point: the importance of forested landscapes to reduce emissions, and at the same time to enhance the adaptation capacity of the local population. Some considerations for landscape restoration planning in Ethiopia, as well as in most countries. But specifically for Ethiopia, policy aspects related to the importance of the forest and water nexus and the necessity of intersectoral coordination. There are different ministries. There's MOE, there's the Ministry of Agriculture, there's the Environment and Forestry and Climate Change Commission. They have similar mandates. They have sometimes overlapping mandates. They have sometimes overlapping geographic scopes, but without intersectoral coordination, the possibilities of joining forces towards securing water regimes are limited. And then the next is the focus on people. And when we talk about focus on people, we are referring to community ownership to ensure the long-term sustainability. I have seen experiences in different parts of the world where governments come with budgets, engage local people and sometimes pay them a stipend, a salary for their work for a limited time. And this is the problem with the project level intervention or the project scope of intervention, is that after the project leaves, then the people don't have an incentive. But when people own the process and own their benefits, and there is a clear plan for the distribution of benefits of these restoration efforts, then sustainability over the long term is easier. Never guaranteed, because situations change, but it will be better suited. And then speaking of technical aspects, tailor the design of the technical packages to the specific conditions, specific site conditions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, thinking of the future scenarios. So are the species that we are going to plant suited for the future climate scenario? Is the precipitation, the future precipitation that we foresee, the necessary one to support this or that species, and this or that density, and this or that spatial disposition of our efforts? Do we need to plant along contours, or do we need to plant large stands? Do we need to plant homogeneous or heterogeneous stands? Do we need to plant exotic versus native? Do we need to plant perennial versus caducifolious species? And at the same time, thinking of the multiple products that can be obtained and the multiple benefits that can be obtained from our restoration efforts. And related to this, it is important to mention the commercial integration of the products that we are trying to obtain. So how can we support that these communities that are now in charge of managing the forests, the agroforestry systems, the forested landscapes that we are restoring, how can we guarantee that they can reach the market in a position that is sufficiently convenient to obtain enough benefits to reinvest in the system? And for this, I come to the last part, which is the financial aspects. So what kind of incentives can we put in place? And here's an important role of the public sector, but at the same time of the private sector. So here's where there's a confluence of the two interests. So if it's really an interest of the government to promote reforestation, to promote restoration using the assortment of techniques, what incentives can we put in place? Can we give a tax break to a company that invests in a certain type of restoration activity? Can we give another kind of incentive, the payment for ecosystem services scheme, to make sure that the benefits that people down the stream are getting, and those benefits can then go up the watershed and support the efforts of the farmers that are in the higher part of the basin. And sometimes some financial vehicles can be created or can be promoted, basically to break the dependence on grants. Like we mentioned before, projects have a limited time. Projects have a limited life cycle. So what happens after the grant? And grants are very good for creating examples, for creating models that then can be replicated, but all the grant money in the world will never be sufficient for the enormous goals of landscape restoration. The estimate is that between 300 and 500 billion are needed a year to do forest landscape restoration across the world. And let's be realistic, grant money will not be sufficient. So another more creative type of financial vehicles will be needed. Maybe equity funds, maybe some sort of guarantees will need to be put in place. So just to finish my presentation very soon, crucial for Ethiopia's future is the restoration of upland watershed. And there are some areas, there has been remarkable efforts by the government of Ethiopia with the support of different development partners to identify the critical watersheds that need to be restored. This should give us hints of where to start putting the efforts. And this should give us hints of where this cross-sectoral, intersectoral coordination and cooperation is needed. So just the last few reflections. The area that across the world is being managed for water and soil conservation is increasing, and a quarter of all the forests are managed with this purpose. But we have to ask ourselves the question, as foresters, is planting trees the one size fits all solution? Does it just work because we plant trees? Is it true that planting trees will always give us more water and more benefits down the streams? Well, this is to be discussed, but as a preamble, many of you may be familiar with this report. This was launched last year and the final edition was published this year. This is the Climate Change and Land Report of IPCC. And some of the lessons, some of the key messages of this report is that preventing forest loss and forest degradation is always preferable to restoring. Restoring is going to cost us more, and not always restoring brings the benefits that we expect, especially if we don't plan according to the site conditions and we don't plan according to the socioeconomical conditions, and if we don't plan according to the future climate change scenarios. So some activities can have a negative impact in food security, in water availability, and there is science to support this. So there are studies that show different results, but you can see the highlighted text on the right, and it shows how grassland reforestation, this refers to areas that the natural land cover would be grassland. Reforesting there in areas where forest is not the natural land cover has a negative result and has a negative impact in the water resources. Different studies exist about this. There are hydrological and soil impacts of forestation that can be negative and that can be contrary to our targets. Declines in dry season flows because of the higher water use of the tree species that was implemented or that was used for implementing the forest restoration. So one needs to, as a practitioner, one needs to, and as a policymaker and as a decision maker, one needs to take all this into consideration. So this example speaks of planting pine trees in areas where broadleaf forest normally exists, and broadleaf forest that will lose the foliage seasonally and reduce the evaporation, not the evapotranspiration, but especially evaporation, especially in the dry season. So if we plant trees that will continue to evaporate water at the same time that precipitation is reduced, probably the impact is going to be negative in our water balance. And this is especially important in areas with low precipitation. And just the last part is, well, the importance of riparian zones, which is undisputed. And restoring riparian zones is a no regret option. Of course, again, tree selection and system selection is important, but restoring riparian zones is a necessity. And this is another picture taken in Oromia, where you can see the completely deforested, formerly riparian zone that is in dire need of restoration. And with this, I think I have completed my presentation maybe 3 minutes after the time they gave me. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Luis. It provides us with some of the information and then experience and practical cases, not only on the theoretical, aspect, also practical. And I liked your suggestion saying that when we formulate the plans, that we need to consider 3 elements: policy, technical, and finance aspects. Unless we understand all these aspects, we cannot bring the tangible outcomes out of any activities, I believe. And then you also raised a very good question about one size fits all really works. And then that's where actually global society started before. But as we have accumulated experiences in working with different parts of the world, and then I know that at least many people start to have questions about this approach. In that regard, and then Luis illustrated a pretty good aspects that is immediately related to Ethiopia. So having said that, now I'd like to open the floor. We have about, I would say 5 to 10 minutes for a Q&A. And then Luis, can you see one question from the chatting window? Can you see that?
Let's see. Yes, I see many questions.
Yes. You see some questions. Actually, there is a question, so directed to your presentation. So maybe that can be the starting point for you to answer, respond to the questions or comments from the trainees.
Okay. Okay, should I start with the first one?
Yeah, I mean, you can pick, whatever. I don't think you have enough time to answer all. So, just to pick some of them if you can, or just one, and then.
Okay. We can say that plantation of eucalyptus is effective forest landscape restoration process? Because I tried to see pictures from your presentation, and Oromia parts of Ethiopia are covered with these species, and it's obvious there is a large bareland mountains in the country, so that it's significant to cover the areas with the behavior of eucalyptus. Okay, so this brings this is a great question, and this brings us to the polemics between native species, exotic species, and the myths about eucalyptus and the consumption of water of eucalyptus. Well, first of all, there are many species of eucalyptus, and no species is good or bad per se. And again, it depends on the site conditions of where we are going to do our restoration practice. But eucalyptus in Ethiopia, in the context of Ethiopia, and in many other countries, is a species that grows fast, that can produce a number of products. So firewood, charcoal, construction materials, timber when you grow it to the necessary sizes. There is a place to put each species, and there is a system, and there is a density, and there is a disposition on the ground that we should be analyzing. So if the precipitation conditions are very low, so species like eucalyptus or maybe pine tree, like we saw in the examples before, if they evaporate and they consume more water than it is available, then maybe the eucalyptus won't even grow if we planted it in the wrong site. And if it grows, it may be consuming more water than it is available. And the result will be that it will reduce the base flow of the watershed. But we are not talking about covering the whole watershed with eucalyptus. We may be thinking of putting the eucalyptus in strategic places where it can grow, where it can satisfy the needs of the local population, and it can produce benefits that we are expecting. So again, landscape restoration is not one single activity, and it's not one single system. It's a mosaic, it's a combination.
Okay, and then if there is any other questions or comments, you can raise them now.
Sure. Hello, I'm happy to join and attend the workshop on the current issues. So world and Ethiopia in particular, I need to address, to communicate you at any time if you are a volunteer. Well, I'm also in Oromia, Ethiopia. Can we do anything related to forestry, agroforestry, and soil management? Okay, good question too. We are working with GDGI and the government of Ethiopia in designing operations related to forest landscape restoration. There will be opportunities to implement a combination of systems on the ground. At this point, I cannot tell you if Oromia will be the specific area that is selected, but it's possible. And basically, what we are thinking as our approach is to find areas that are in the interest of the different ministries. So if the Ministry of Water and the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment or the Commission have a common interest, then there are better opportunities to build this cooperation and and take along the restoration activities with more feasibility.
Okay, I think there must be another question. Unless I have a burning questions to Luis, then maybe it's time for us to close this session. Is there any burning questions that you cannot avoid? Just waiting for another time to raise? I don't see anyone. Okay, then. Luis, thank you very much for your time. It's a pretty late evening in Seoul, 9 p.m. So
Yes.
Once again, thank you very much for your time and then the wonderful presentation for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.